well, you all know, we've all seen concave Preston curves and other income-health relationships that show that as income improves, health also improves, but not at the same rate, but at a decreasing rate. And that's what we imposed by estimated with a second-degree income polynomial. We did also experiment with higher orders of polynomials in order to keep this as flexible as possible, but for the relevant range, so the relevant range where most of the incomes are, the relationship remains concave. So for 98% or so of the Spanish, Greek, and Portuguese population, this relationship turns out to be concave. Interestingly, we also have other characteristics which will prove to be important. The vector X includes some things which are certainly not influenced by income, like age and gender groups, the 18 regions in Spain, not 18 regions in Greece and Portugal, and 5 employment categories, because our suspicion is that employment has got something to do with the crisis, as we heard over and over again over the last few years. And this is not to be causally interpreted. I sometimes say in these presentations we could also estimate income as a function. We could put income here and health there, and we could roughly do a similar analysis of health-related income inequality, and the message would not change very much. So we're not implying any, by calling this income-related health inequality, we're not implying that the causality goes from income to health. I can come back to that at the end. Okay, let's have a look. So we did this for the 3 countries, and for the 3 years for which we had data for all 3 countries. And this is the first, well, not unimportant. What happened to mean cohort income? Yeah, we kept the cohorts constant. So in Spain we had 12,000 households that we could follow up for 3 years. There's about 6,000 in Greece. I can't remember exactly the names, the numbers, but it's a bit smaller in Portugal. Well, first observation is mean incomes different substantially between these countries, but also the changes differ. So in Spain in 2009 it still went up, which is also true for the other 2 countries, but it went down for the first time in 2010. As I already said, we also have an extra year for Spain. I haven't got it on the slide, but I can trust me, it goes down further in 2011, as you would expect as a result of the crisis. Interestingly, in Portugal, in 2008 and 2009, there has not been a decrease in income. I mean, it could be a decrease in the rise, but it's still not a real negative change in incomes, which there is in Greece and there was in Spain as well in 2010, which, as I said, is the prior 12 months income. Income inequality, again, was referred to yesterday. Well, again, we see different patterns here between the 3 countries. In Spain, no change in the first year, but then, well, I think Beatrice called it yesterday quite a sharp rise in not to 34, but at least to 32. And again, I can confirm that in 2011 it goes up further, the income inequality in Spain. Also in Greece, similar thing happened, but to a lesser extent, no change at all in the first year, and only a slight rise in the third. And then, surprise, surprise, Portugal, which has got by far the highest income inequality, which we saw earlier as well, in the European context, its income inequality is quite high, but there was a fall, not a rise, in the latest year that we show here, 2010, the latest year that we have for Portugal. Well, mean cohort health is not very interesting because this is, with this interval regression, you impose the thresholds, well, which we get from a Canadian survey, and doesn't make much difference, but you have to know that these are all predicted health levels. So it's not a surprise that with an aging cohort, these predicted mean adult levels fall because the cohort gets a year older every year. It also in some years got a bit richer, but apparently the age effect is stronger than the income effect there, if we can call it an effect. So, but note, as we saw before, that the Portuguese rate their health quite a bit lower than the Spaniards and the Greeks here. Interestingly, I won't say anything about regional differences other than this, that if we looked at the differences between regions and how they rated their health, then the Galicians were closest to the Portuguese, and quite a bit lower than the Catalans in their health utility index. Okay, this is the answer to the quiz question. What happened to income-related health inequality in the three countries? Well, I asked you for Spain, and I think I only saw 5 hands thinking. 6? I think there are prizes left enough. So in Spain we see a fall. Okay, I'm not sure whether this is a significant fall, but it's certainly not, as many of you expected, the same or more. So, and I'll explain in the next slides why I think this is, well, we think this is happening. No change at all in Greece, and only in Portugal, well, a substantial rise in the measured degree of income, well, in the pro-rich inequality in health as reported by the Portuguese by income. Now, why would that be the case? Well, then we need to go back to our decomposition. This is the result of the decomposition exercise that I explained for China, but now for the 3 countries in Europe, Spain, Greece, and Portugal, and with an extra year added for Spain. Well, let's run you through it. These are the changes that I just showed you in the previous slide. So a small fall in Spain, virtually no change in Greece, and a rise in Portugal. And these are the 3 terms that I explained earlier. This is the effect of proportional income growth or fall, if it's negative growth, of course. Not much going on here. Well, there is an exception in Portugal. It did matter. Income inequality, that's not the... Well, the changes in income inequality are not explaining why we see the changes, if we do see them, in income-related health inequality. Again, the most important term turns out to be income mobility. What happens to different people in the income distribution with different characteristics when they move in these 3 years from one year to the next? And also the categorical mobility of aging or of moving from one category to another, not so important, except that for the small effect in Greece, it's got some implications. So I think what we have to focus on, what we have to zoom in on, is the mobility. Remember, I said that in China it was the elderly females that were left behind. So let's see who are the groups in Spain, Greece, and Portugal. Let me just add that if we add an extra year, and we stick to 3-year comparisons in order to have sufficient number of observations, but in Spain is the largest sample, that's fine. So you see, if you have an extra year, the fall in income-related health inequality is a bit larger than what you have in the first 3 years only. So it's not the negative income growth, it's not the rise or fall of inequality in incomes, but it's rather the income mobility, term 3, that seems to be the most important reason here for the changes that we see. So who's hit differentially? Well, we can look at it. Well, one thing we can do is differentiate these terms. We can sort of decompose this term further by each of the X characteristics. So we can look at which groups have moved up in the ranking, which groups have moved down. But a better way of showing that is by showing you, just for the last 2 years, the changes that people have actually experienced by certain characteristics. So this is a table that shows us, first of all, for each of the 3 countries, the income levels for these age groups, gender groups. So we split them into, well, these age gender groups. And then you can see that in 2010, income obviously rises, although it's sort of highest in the 26 to 35, then falls again. Remember, this is per capita, per equivalent adult, so that's when families, probably households, are growing again, and then they're getting smaller again, the kids have left the house, and the income goes up. So to some extent, this is driven by the equalizing of the incomes, and then it goes down again, as you would expect, when people retire. But these are just averages, means. Same for Greece, same for Portugal in 2010. Let's now look at the change in the last year, from 9 to 10, and well, proportionally as a proportion of the 2009 income. And then you see, I've highlighted some of them, there's significant negative changes of all Spanish age groups, male and female, up to age 55. Well, there's also some negative ones here, but these are the larger ones. And that's just what must have happened between 9 and 10. Much smaller falls here. So not really rises either, but the older groups have apparently suffered less of the crisis, or if this can be attributed to the crisis, in that have certainly suffered less income loss in the year 2010. If you then look at the other countries, well, I'll explain how this, well, let me just first look at the other countries. So, of course, we know Greece has got, on average, lower incomes, similar patterns by age, and Portugal, again, lower, but again, similar patterns by age. So the countries are not that dissimilar in showing the same age profiles. But there are differences in the changes. In Greece, as in Spain, also the young adults, but not up until 55, but rather up until 35, the younger adults, have suffered, well, in 2010, the greatest income losses. Other groups have still gained even. Some of them here at, well, this, the males, 66, so the retired males, have even increased their incomes, and this is a cohort, this is the same individuals. If you look at the columns for Portugal, then again we see even substantial rises still in 2010. So in Portugal the incomes haven't fallen yet, certainly not for young adults, and that's the biggest difference with Spain. So if this is an effect of the crisis, then in Spain it has affected this age group and not in Portugal. In Portugal also not the older group, but remember that what is important is the ranking. So the gains of the older Portuguese are much smaller than the gains of the younger Portuguese. So these elderly Portuguese move down in the income ranking, whereas these move up in the income ranking. So they're not really growing richer, but they move up in the income ranking because these are going down. And of course, the older people are the ones with the lowest self-assessed health levels, which translates in lower health utility levels. And the picture is least clear for Greece, in fact, where there is no clear difference between young and old, because, well, you would say it's the same as in well, similar to Spain, but then you see at this very old age, I don't know why, over 75, there's still a fall, which there doesn't seem to be between, well, 66 and the early retired, well, the young retired, if I can call them like that. Okay, so that's just ages, and the upshot is that because the young lose more than the rich, well, than the old, sorry, in Spain, that explains why they move down in the income ranking and the elderly move up in the income ranking. That's not happening in Portugal. The opposite is happening in Portugal. Now, interestingly, let's look at employment groups. So these are the employed, unemployed, retired, and disabled. And again, the incomes of each of those groups, not too dramatically different across countries. They differ between categories, obviously. It would be a surprise if the employed didn't have the highest incomes. So the differences between categories across countries are not so important, but again, the changes differ, the changes of these. So in all countries, clearly, being unemployed is not good for your income, but it's particularly the case in Spain and Portugal, and apparently less so, at least in 2010, in Portugal. The employed lost out, as we already saw, the younger adults in Spain, but not in Portugal. And again, it's the same mechanism as we saw before, but these characteristics are entered, well, in addition to the age sex categories, so they will also contribute to the changes that we see in income-related health inequality. I don't discuss the disabled and the other because they're relatively small categories, but important is, of course, where the retired are, because, again, a lot of the ill health will be concentrated in this group, and they didn't lose yet in Spain. Things may change in the future, but they did lose already in Greece, and to a lesser extent in Portugal, where I think pension cuts only came in 2012, as Pedro was telling me yesterday. Okay, where does that leave us? Conclusions. How am I doing about time? Fine? Too quick? Too slow? Okay. Let me put some conclusions, and then you have time to sort of question me on this. The economic crisis has only started to affect household disposable incomes in 2010, which is why in the latter slides I focused on the last year changes. 2009 is really too early to see anything in households' disposable incomes, the cash they get every month. There's little or no effect, or at least we didn't even try to estimate a health effect for the reasons that I explained earlier. That's a very difficult exercise to do in a credible way. And especially with a cohort, it's predictable how the health is going to change. Then we found that the income-related health inequality